panic attacks, suicide, ADHD, all of this is on the rise.
Yes.
What is it that young people could do in order to help themselves?
In short, I would say, and I will elaborate on the short answer is do more hard stuff.
Hard like?
If it is hard for you to connect as a man with your emotions and your anger and your rage, and you try to avoid it, I can guarantee you.
Welcome everybody to another episode of On Path, where we explore the mindset, the hardships, the strategies used by other creators, thinkers, entrepreneurs, and high performers, so you can apply the lessons to build your favorite life. In today's episode, our guest is Atlas Martin, who has survived a severe accident a few years back, and after emerging from a 2 months long coma, this is when he began his true healing journey. With over 7 years of experience healing himself from his own traumas using different kind of natural methods and physiotherapy and hypnotherapy, NLP, breathwork, and many more, now he is on a mission to help and guide others on their healing journey. In today's episode, we talk about what trauma is, where it's coming from, how it manifests, how we can deal with panic attacks, how we can build emotional resilience, and even how psychological release can ease physical pain. This episode is packed with useful tips and tools that we can apply in our day-to-day life, so make sure you stick around and enjoy the episode. Atlas,
Adam,
how would you explain trauma to someone who just recently started researching this topic?
I would first of all tell them that it is something that's not permanent. A lot of times people seem to feel that they have trauma and it's forever part of them. And secondly, I would say, or given this analogy of a wound, because it is an emotional wound. And I would describe it in the same way as when you hurt yourself as a child or as an adult, and you have a scratch or actual wound where the skin is open. It's exactly the same situation, but based on our emotions and our emotional body. And what happens is, it is the same, and it might be a little bit graphic for some people, but when you have a cut skin, you can see the inside of it, and it's tender, and it's bleeding. And it's the same as experiencing a very highly traumatizing situation, or a lot of them. It creates this wound where there is that part that is tender, which you could say the triggers that you might experience as a result of being wounded and traumatized are that tenderness of this area. And what tends to happen is, obviously over time we're used to our own scars being like our wounds, physical wounds, being naturally healing. And unfortunately, it's not the case for emotional or sexual or any other trauma that we might pick up in our life. We need, I would use another analogy, we need help with healing that. Also, similar to when we heal an actual physical wound, we need the ointments, we need the cream, we need someone to actually look at this and tell us how bad or how superficial it is. And I think it's a great analogy to look at it this way, because then when someone comes with their experience, that being a therapist or that being a trauma expert, they could look at this and say, listen, you need a certain amount of therapy, or you need a certain amount of using this type of modality or breath work or anything else that they might know that it will work on that wound. And then slowly, with practice, healing that wound, closing it, making it less tender, making it so you can actually touch it, which means You can be in a situation that maybe back in the past was traumatizing for you, and now it's not triggering you. I'll give you an example from my own life. Um, I've realized I've had big trauma that was still an open wound emotionally for many, many years because of the way I was brought up and the disconnection I had with my father. And to the point where I was avoiding consciously coming close to situations that I would be highly triggered. And one of the examples would be avoiding going into parks that there was an area where kids could play with their parents, where I could see a father and a son play together, because it would break me. I would burst into tears and I would have to remove myself, and I would be unhinged emotionally for another day or so, because it would play into my mind this victimhood mentality where, like, why I didn't experience that. And it became a great indicator of the work I was doing later on in years in my own journey, to see how much of that wound have been healed. And I'll give you the opposite of that, where I could see all my work and so many years of it taking shape. Was last year I was in Kuala Lumpur, and one of the really beautiful parks there near KLCC Center. And I was just reflecting. I was listening to some podcast while sitting on a bench. And in front of me, there was this beautiful scene of a father playing with his maybe 4 or 5-year-old son, and then giving him some gloves, like small boxing gloves. And it looked so cute. And the father was showing him how to box, how to fight, how to be a little warrior. And again, back in the past, that would have really break me and unhinged me into a lot of sorrow and sadness. And I remember seeing them, and it brought me so much compassion, joy, gratitude, because I could see this father doing the best he could with whatever he could do. I could see the gloves not being new; they were used, and at some stage when they finished, I walked up to the father when the boy was playing around somewhere on the side. I didn't want to scare the boy, and I asked him if I can share something with him. And all of a sudden, I realized he had a very good English, and I told him my reflection that I saw him play with his son, and it was such a beautiful sight. And I applauded him for taking the time, maybe from his busy life, busy day, to just spend his time with his son. And he bursted into tears. He was like, and he was, I'd say, I didn't go into details, but I'd say he was close to his 40s. He bursted into tears and said that he's never heard any other man tell him something like that and acknowledge him to do something simple and something that he loved to do with his son. And and that created I believe, a lasting impression on him, but also it gave me this confirmation of the time that I spent working with myself and on that wound, that exactly specific wound that I described earlier on, that it's been healed for me. I can press on it, and I can see the compassion, and I can feel what I need to feel for myself, but also what I can feel from my father now.
I think that's something that's going to stay with the person for quite some time. From his point of view, it almost feels like that God sent you to deliver this message to him, that whatever he is doing with his son is something that he should continue. When we go back to your example, when you went to the park and you just couldn't stand being around that area where fathers were playing with their kids,
Yeah.
did you know at the time that it's actually coming from a trauma that you had? Was this clear to you? Or what are the different kind of symptoms that people can look for to figure out whether they have trauma or they don't?
Mm-hmm. I would say, based on my experience, and I realized that in this situation, in this type of trauma, and in this environment where I could see boys playing with their fathers, and I never experienced that properly with my own dad, I realized I had a very small emotional bandwidth that allowed me to live a life. And in general, my emotional bandwidth was okay and quite resilient in a lot of different parts of my life. But where it came to that specific part of the life where I could experience other men spending time with their younger sons, I realized my emotional bandwidth was very small and I could get overwhelmed very easily with a lot of emotions.
What is emotional bandwidth?
And where it comes to emotional bandwidth, I believe this is a term that I've created. I haven't seen or heard it in any other places, and I realized this is a pipe that has a size and a volume that it can take, and it grows with us. It expands based on the practices that we do for our own emotional resilience, and it's deeply connected to our emotional resilience. So what I would explain very easily as emotional bandwidth, it would be the amount of overwhelming emotions or emotions in general that we can take at one specific time or a day, that it will not overwhelm us to the point where it will result in either a panic attack or an anxiety attack, or God forbid, in the extreme situations, suicidal thoughts or something even worse. And the way I look at emotional bandwidth is it can expand as the circumsize of the what's the word I'm missing? The size of the pipe can increase, but also the speed of the emotions that flow through it can increase. And I believe our day-to-day life takes quite a big chunk of the emotional bandwidth. What also takes a lot of emotional bandwidth in the whole, the volume of it, is exactly what we discussed earlier, is the trauma that is unresolved. The wounds that need tending all the time, that are not resolved and they're not, fully healed, they automatically take a big chunk of our emotional wellness and the emotional bandwidth as a default. So when we carry these wounds, we carry that space being taken all the time. And only when we start looking at these wounds and these traumas and heal them, they remove the space is freed. And the more of that space that we have freed from the practices that we employ to help ourselves, we create that empty space. And that empty space allows us to go through life without being challenged so much, without being overwhelmed. I strongly believe there is a correlation between having free bandwidth for whatever can happen. Someone could have an accident that you care about. Someone, God forbid, could die from your family. And it might be an event that when you have very little emotional bandwidth left, it will unhinge you. It will create so much more trouble for you. So my daily practices, weekly practices, monthly, yearly practices allow me to foster and create more space in the emotional bandwidth. And I see this in work with some of my clients, where I meet them, one of the first emotions or feelings that they are having is, I am on the brink of being overwhelmed. Whereas if their order on Grab is late, they are feeling overwhelmed. If something breaks in their bike or in their car, they feel overwhelmed. I'm sure you've seen this in sports as well, where athletes are, when something doesn't go their way, they don't have this emotional capacity and resilience to hold that space for themselves. And their emotions take over and they break, they unhinge, they have an anxiety or anger attack or anything like that. And I truly believe that having, not only knowing what the emotional bandwidth of your emotional bandwidth is at each time, each day, each week, but also knowing what helps you to not only create more space in the pipe of the emotional bandwidth, but also how to expand your emotional bandwidth. Because we are born with a certain amount, and I believe that pipe grows with us. We have a capacity to grow this to a huge, massive pipe where nothing really phases you in life. And sometimes when you see people who have this almost a stoic demeanor, it's not because inside they're boiling. It's because day-to-day life or even extreme situations really don't phase them. Not in a way that they're almost without feelings about this, but the feelings that they have are still within the volume that they can hold, which means they have control over it. They have this, I would say, a calm demeanor of accepting for how it's happening in their life, being a tragedy, being their business failing. And I see this more and more often, especially with young men, where they cannot deal with basic life skills that and life events that overwhelm them, and it's worrying to me. That's why at some stage last year I decided to help men. That focus has shifted, but I still work with men. Um, and I see this in women when, and I would say emotionally, women are naturally much more well equipped to deal with emotions, and their emotional bandwidth grows faster in their upbringing. It is said that it's usually between 2 to 3 years of difference. So, an emotional maturity of a 15-year-old or 18-year-old, so 18-year-old man would have emotional maturity of a 15-year-old woman. So, the other way around, 15-year-old woman will have a maturity of an 18-year-old man, because they acquire these skills easier and quicker in their life.
So the more trauma we have, the more trauma we carry from the past, the less our emotional bandwidth is that we can actually utilize in the day-to-day life, right?
Yes.
Where is that kind of where is trauma actually coming from? Is this something that can be passed on to us, or that's something that happened to us in the past, or that's something that's happening in our day-to-day? So where is trauma actually coming from?
How was it created? There's many types of wounding and emotional trauma that we can pick up in life. Obviously, some by our own doing, and some by the circumstance and how we were raised and grew up. I would answer this telling you a simple analogy and story about a lake. So imagine, because I'd like to tell you an experience, and for the listeners to experience this in the form of conscious and subconscious, because there are some conscious decisions that we make that create the trauma for us, but also subconscious ones, and that's where usually the traumatic and wounding events stay with us. So when I spoke about emotional bandwidth, a lot of that trauma that's stored and takes that real estate, it lives in our subconscious. It is said that 85 to 90% of our decisions are driven by our subconscious. And that's where the wounding and the emotional trauma stays in subconscious and drives the 10% of our conscious decisions. So coming back to the concept of lake of emotions and conscious and subconscious, imagine seeing this beautiful serene lake with all the green nature around it. Everything above the water I would regard as consciousness, and everything below the water I would regard as unconscious. And when we get traumatized in our childhood, and our formative years between 0 and 7 are one of the most important ones, but also we can pick up trauma at any stage afterwards as well. There's a secondary stage where we can pick up trauma, which is between the ages of 7 and 12 or 15, depending if you're a woman or a man, as I mentioned, the 3-year gap. And what happens is the ages between 0 and 7, they are the most formative years for the subconscious brain. Everything that is programmed into our psyche tends to stay for a very, very long time or forever in our psyche. Whereas the traumas that are being picked up later, they're actually easier to release. They are less ingrained. They're not as deep. So coming back to the concept of the emotional lake, I would say imagine we have the bottom of the lake. And on the bottom of the lake, if the lake is clear and there's no trauma in your life, you would see a beautiful ecosystem, vegetation, flourishing, everything is growing. And that's how it starts for us. As little toddlers, we grasp everything, and it starts growing in this beautiful, and the subconscious starts being taught, yeah, this is your mom, this is your dad, it's safe. And what starts to happen is the little traumas that we experience would take form of either pebbles, big stones, or sand. But the reality of it is, under the pebbles, on the floor of the lake, nothing can grow. Under the sand, which is small, tiny, repeated traumas that we can pick up as well, nothing can grow. Same with big rocks that are thrown into the lake and stay at the bottom of the lake, nothing can grow. So the types, these 3 types, I would say the pebbles are smaller situations where we as a child are told or shown by our family or friends of family or our grandparents or anyone who is a caregiver in those formative years. They are showing you these smaller situations where you're told, this is bad, this is good, but then when you want attention, let's say from a caregiver, you're withdrawn that attention. And if that attention and that love, and if it's withdrawn for too long, it creates a big trauma, which would be a rock. But if it's a small withdrawals of attention, it creates pebbles, and it creates confusion for the child. So these pebbles then start creating, like maybe this size, they start living rent-free on the bottom of the lake, not allowing that child then to create and foster nourishment for their own psyche, but also not to be able to grow in those areas. So also, it's a finite amount that we have. So if there's a finite amount and 30% or 40% of the real estate of the bottom of the subconscious lake is taken by the sand, pebbles, and big traumas, then it's only for 50% or less for the other parts of your own learning, of positive reinforcements, of positive view on life left for you, for your subconscious. And I think the balance between these two determines how the person perceives later in their life as a teenager and as an adult, how they perceive world. Because if there's more than 50% of that real estate on the bottom of the lake taken by this trauma, their view will be mostly negative. Whereas if it's less, it will be mostly positive. Even if it's 55 to 45, it will already have a big impact. So coming back to the types of trauma, the rocks, the big rocks, are the ones that have a very deep, like they would be very deep wounds. For example, being never accepted or given love from your father or mother. being told or shown that your needs as a child do not matter, because that translates to a young child as feeling that I do not belong here on earth. There's it shows the child that there's no reason for me to be here, and that's why later on in life, where adults grow from this type of childhood, and we're not even talking about abuse yet, they tend to have these mm, thoughts about, do I really matter? Does my existence bring anything to this earth? Does it bring anything to my family? And their worldview is shaped based on being told that they're not lovable, that they do not deserve to be loved. And that unfortunately creates a lot of different dynamics that will play out in a lot of traumatic ways later in life. Where it comes to sand, um, sand is created as multiples, and I mean hundreds of very tiny, tiny little nuances that happen in interactions between obviously close family, but then friends. When you go to a kindergarten, and then all of a sudden, three of your friends in the kindergarten, when you're 3 or 4 or 5, show you these disdain, maybe don't like you, but it's a repeated small traumatic events that happen in formative years. And what tends to happen is then, because it takes more and more real estate in the emotional and subconscious lake, it creates this thought, oh, other people tell me as well and show me by this little gestures that I also am not worthy. And then that creates very low self-esteem. It creates times for people where they don't love themselves, to the point where it might end up with scarring themselves, might end up with addiction, might end up with them needing to soothe that pain that comes so deeply from within. On the other hand, when we have a child who is maybe free from big traumatic events in their life, because that can also, and it's beautiful that it happens, but they have the pebbles and the sand in their emotional lake, it is slightly easier for them to look at the world, have a little bit more positive view of the world. And what tends to happen is they live life with this positive outlook. And when they do that, they do have that positive outlook on life. It is very easy to pick up a pebble 100 times rather than pick up a massive rock one time. It is much less effort. Same with sand. So then later on in life, when they learn emotional resilience tools that can help them to move these, they tend to have much better results with accessing their emotions, and they have much better results by working with these tools to remove this trauma. Where it comes to big stones, it is much harder, and unfortunately it takes a lot of resilience and preparation to be able to hold space for yourself, to the point where a lot of time people say, I don't want to relive my trauma, I don't want to be re-traumatized, because when they do that, it simply comes from self-preservation. They don't want to be destroyed again. They don't want to feel so unworthy again. And I strongly believe, and we're going a little bit sideways from this question, but I think it's important to note that you don't need to re-traumatize yourself to be able to heal your wounding. All you need to do is slowly create emotional resilience to be able to pick up smaller pieces from that big rock and move it away. move it away. You don't have to lift the whole rock at once. But sometimes it's so overwhelming that people think it is so big that I'd rather live with the pain of my existence right now than pick up that massive rock, revisit that traumatic event because it's so overwhelming.
Gabor Mate has this analogy where trauma is like a puppet master in your subconscious
Yes.
that's kind of like pulling the strings, and you are not even aware that this is actually happening, which I just found a very interesting example. And it also helped me to understand what's happening in the background, that you are not even aware that it's actually there. But once you become aware, right, that's pretty much the first step towards actually fixing your problems.
Yes.
You mentioned something which I found very interesting, building resilience, right? So if you look at what's happening in today's world, we can see that panic attacks, suicide, ADHD, all of this is on the rise.
Yes.
What is it that young people could do in order to help themselves?
In short, I would say, and I will elaborate on the short answer is do more hard stuff.
Hard stuff.
Hard.
Hard like?
Um, if it is hard for you to connect as a man with your emotions and your anger and your rage, and you try to avoid it, I can guarantee you one day you will explode. And that explosion will, for a lack of a better word, vomit on a lot of people you wouldn't want to. And it's our responsibility as men and women as well, as humans, to be able to regulate ourselves and our nervous systems to the point where it is safe for us to feel anger and any other emotion, shame, resentment, all these negative emotions. So I would say it is very important for young men and women who are starting to experience these episodes of, as you said, being overwhelmed by ADHD, panic attacks, anxiety, overthinking. It is very important for them to acknowledge it first, realize that they're not the victim, that they have control over their own life, and realize that they can slowly take right steps towards building the resilience, as you mentioned and as you asked about, towards having a bigger emotional bandwidth. And it can come in many different forms. I would firstly recommend just connecting with your own emotions and being able just to name them is already a big step. When I asked men in the past, what are the primary emotions that you feel as a man, is I am angry, I am sad, I am happy, and I am horny. These are the four emotions or emotional states that most men would report back. Luckily for women, they can feel much more, and it's beautiful. And I think a lot of men could learn from women where it comes to their emotional capacity and capability of speaking about emotions. And coming back to what you asked, is how can we create that space for ourselves, and looking at situations where we cannot be left without a phone or some kind of distraction. Taking it slow, practicing at 1 minute, practicing with 2 minutes, 3 minutes of maybe just sitting by the side of the on the beach, by the river, bringing yourself maybe more often to nature, and depending on the person you are, setting up little systems where they allow you to disconnect from the virtual world and allowing you to stay for a few minutes with peace, with quiet, listening to the birds. And I know it sounds cliche, but the more you disconnect from the outside world, you start to connect to your own heart, to your own thoughts, seeing the quality of the thoughts that running through your head based on the content that you feed yourself. And I can see this in myself back in the day when I was feeding myself not the right content, not the right movies, not the right entertainment, even. The quality of my thoughts would be meh. It would be below what I am capable of. I was refusing to accept it, maybe because the way I am as a person. And I realized I needed to feed myself better food, better thoughts. In the way I'm saying it right now, choosing the right ingredients of my life to nourish me more. I'll give an example from daily life. I used to love entertainment. I lived by a fantastic cinema back in Ireland. Literally 1 minute I was in the cinema club. I would be in the cinema at least twice a week. And unfortunately, it was a mainstream cinema, so I would subject myself to all sorts of movies. And I realized that the more work I started to do on my emotional resilience, on bringing a lot of mindful practices into my life to build the emotional bandwidth, I realized I was straining out from movies about war, violence. I remember this very clearly because it was a time when all the Avengers movies came out and I was a big fan of back from the day with Transformers and Optimus Prime and all this. But it's always anger, it's always fight, it's always war. And I realized that I was feeding myself all of this because I had a lot of anger in myself. But the moments I started to release that anger healthy in healthy ways through all these tools, I realized I did not need to feed myself more anger from the outside sources. I stopped watching the big Hollywood movies and I started watching content that was nourishing me in the way that I call them feel good movies, either psychology, philosophy, real people, real emotions, real life. And yet again, I'm still entertained by movies like Deadpool. But it has come at a ratio of maybe three such movies in a year, maybe four, to everything else being learning, being instead of entertainment, more of a study of us as humans, as psychology. Also, obviously, documentaries, which are fantastic. Um, Coming back to how younger people would be able to create more of that resilience, I would say slowly spending more time alone with themselves, bringing yourself more to nature. Nature as a white noise alone is soothing. And it's this good type of soothing that we need in our journey first. I would later on tell you about the types of soothing that are not right, are not well intended. But for now, this type of nature soothing, it changes the dynamic of the thoughts we have. It changes the vibration and the frequency of our own bodies. And this is fully proven in science. The term of grounding ourselves. A lot of people say, "Oh, I feel ungrounded, ungrounded." It's not because we're really flying away from this reality. It's about us really being the conductor of this bigger frequency that's on Earth right now, that's generated by Earth, and it's the general hum of the Earth. How we access it? By removing our shoes, by walking barefoot on the beach or on the grass, as little as 3 minutes will ground you. And if you do that repeatedly, this practice daily will bring you much more peace, because your energetic battery that we have in our bodies will start vibrating at a different frequency. It will allow you to be calmer. It will allow you to be more sensitive to what is right and what is wrong for you, how it feels in your body. And that's step number one. Just taking stock of how you really feel in your body. And if you feel anger, okay, that's step number one. Name that feeling. If you feel shame, name it. Don't be afraid of feeling you could say, the dark emotions or the negative emotions. They're part of you. You can alchemize them by obviously building more resilience and building more of a, almost like a welcoming way of looking at them. And you can do this and alchemize your feelings by using a tool that I like to use with most of my clients. It's called the Wheel of Emotions. And it's a 3-layer wheel where we have primary, secondary emotions, and then thoughts and feelings connected to all these. And a lot of times when I mentioned at the beginning where men report anger and happiness as almost opposing emotions. Anything that's negative, what's the opposing emotion? Being happy. The reality of it is not true. And you can see that very clearly on Wheel of Emotions, where if you look into, let's say, being afraid as a primary feeling, the emotion that's connected to it is a lot of times anxiety. And an anxiety then will be connected to feeling unsafe and out of control, not having control. What is needed in that time is to accept these feelings and emotions in your body and thoughts connected to this. And to move away from this, we have to create safety and knowingness in our life, which means all we need to do is to look at our current state. Because the moment you take stock of where you are, you remove doubt in your life and you create clarity. This is the first step that you can move away from. If you don't know where you're going from, it's very hard for you to start. You might know where you're going to, but if you don't know where you're going from, it's going to be quite hard for you.
So you mentioned that we need to take stock of our current state. So that's more on the micro level, what's happening in the situation. Does the same practice work on the macro level? Let's say when we speak about our entire life,
Yes.
right? So there are different parts of our life, our social life, our work life, our relationships, our relationship with self, all of those kind of things. So is this a practice that people can also do in order to figure out whether they have certain areas in their lives that they need to examine more? And maybe there is just an underlying trauma that's kind of like holding themselves back to develop in that direction.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned this. Definitely, I think there is at least 5 to 7 different planes that we can rate ourselves at. Not so I would mention few. So financially, health wise, in terms of our physical health, but also emotional health. Then we have our relationships. Then we have our entrepreneurial or business endeavors or our work environment. And if, for example, we are able to say or rate ourselves that we are working on most of these at the same time, because that's how it should look, and growing in all these aspects of our life, then there's a big likelihood that we have we are becoming an integrated person that is starting to embody all our gifts, and it's taking ownership and responsibility for every part of our life. However, on the other side, and I've been there myself, where I have neglected my emotional well-being, and the only two parts of my life that have been very well developed was my career, and I was escaping my emotional well-being through being a high achiever in business and in sports, to the point that um, at 31 years old, which is very past your prime for triathlons and any endurance sports, I was competing on top 10 level in the country. And that meant that I was not only spending 60 hours a week on my business, but another close to 40 hours on training, which means it's taken so much of my real estate and not only my emotional bandwidth, but also my life time wise, that there was no space for anything else, which means everything else was neglected. The relationships, my marriage was neglected. And I know that this was a form of escapism, very, you could say, glamorized one, because when you achieve something at that age, let's say in business or in sports, it is applauded. But no one tells you that, or at least at the time, I didn't have friends or family or people who were seeing the other side of it and telling me, Atlas, it looks great. I'm very happy for you that you're achieving all these things. But have you looked at other parts of your life that are being neglected? And because I didn't have that circle around me, I had to learn the hard way. I had to learn and collapse because of that, because overachieving, because all these, they had to run their course almost. And when that collapse happened, then I re examined everything in my life. Coming back to what you asked, I think it's one of the very easily recognizable symptoms of someone's life when they start to take stock is, if there's many, let's say out of these five areas we mentioned, someone is excelling in one or two of these and everything else is below par, that is a sign of a very unbalanced life, usually filled with escapism, usually filled with trying to make ourselves bigger in one or all two of these parts of life and forgetting everything else because it's too overwhelming for us, because they don't see the results so fast enough. And I chose the sports because I wasn't always athlete, so it was easy for me to pick up a different sport. I knew I could be good at it. Whereas where it came to emotional well-being at the time, I just started meditating and I already could see how challenging it can be to sit down for a few minutes with myself and allow the thoughts to come in. And something that carried me over for so many years is a short quote from my one of my first mentors. He said to me, Atlas, I'm prescribing you right now 10 minutes meditation in the morning and 10 minutes meditation in the evening. And he said straight away, if you cannot meditate for 10 minutes in the morning and in the evening, you have to meditate for 20. Which at the time I laughed at and I was like, that doesn't make sense. But the reality of it is if you cannot see the benefits of spending that time with yourself and being so overwhelmed with everything else that was running in my life, which I was at the time, you will be taken, almost punished by life to take that time. You will need to take that time to sit those 20 minutes in the morning and in the evening. And I realized something, and this is something I just, before this podcast, I shared in my community, is at the times where we employ consistency in our life where it comes to these tools that create and expand our emotional bandwidth, when we employ them consistently through the times when we are thriving, when everything is going our way, this is the exact time to embrace even more of these practices. Why? Because they create a compound interest in our emotional bandwidth. They expand it so much easier because it comes from a strong positive vibrational field. When then, in the times of need, you almost feel, when you build up enough of that emotional resilience, it almost feels that you don't actually have to meditate because you have so much space in between the event that triggered you or would have triggered you to the time when you run out of your emotional real estate, that you're like, I'm good, I'm capable.
What you mentioned with the career, I think so many people resonate with that, including myself.
Mm.
And when it comes to work, it can be escapism. It can be sacred, it can be fulfilling, but it also can become an addiction, which provides a momentary physiological or psychological benefit, but actually causes harm on the long run. When it comes to these kind of challenges that people face, sometimes they don't even know that they have a problem. Or do you think, okay, let me just rephrase this. Do you think that this kind of behavior that's coming from potentially from trauma can be directly linked to addictive behaviors that people develop? Can someone who has a certain type of addiction come purely from trauma and they are just trying to cope with that because they just don't want to experience the suffering and they're trying to reach for something that provides them that momentary relief?
Yes, it is exactly what you said and more. And we already mentioned this earlier on. And what it is when we start looking at our traumas and the wounds, they may be overwhelming. And there's two things that come from trauma. One is pain, and the other one is suffering. And where it comes to pain, the moment we accept that life, being alive, is inherently painful and we cannot escape that, we create a environment of growth because it's unavoidable. It's a part of our life. However, suffering that is a result of experiencing that pain is optional. Where it comes to suffering, a lot of times, a lot of a lot of times, people would experience suffering as a result of that pain rather than actually feeling that pain. And when that suffering becomes overwhelming, it becomes unsufferable, they need to soothe. And soothing can take many different forms. And one of the forms of soothing our own emotional well being and our emotional body is addiction. Addiction to almost anything can create a soothing experience, because the soothing experience is allowing you to disconnect from the suffering that you felt or feeling constantly, and it replaces it with a momentary relief that could be connected to addiction to porn and masturbation, addiction to substances, so alcohol, smoking, vaping, drugs, sweet drinks do the same thing actually. Why? Because sugar is affecting the same brain areas as cocaine. So creating all these addictions to soothe. What tends to happen is then, because they're quite accessible and we don't feel an immediate negative impact of that soothing, we tend to accept it as the answer. That is why a lot of times you could see people being addicted for many, many years in many different areas of their life, while still being unable to move through any of the pain that actually created the suffering. And my answer to that would be, in short, to help yourself. Again, it comes back to taking stock, is you need to accept, and this is one of the first steps of 12 steps in Narcotics Anonymous or Alcoholics Anonymous, is you need to take stock and call yourself an addict.
And again, this is from Gabor Mate. I think he has done amazing. And he mentions something that makes so much sense, that don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. So that actually helps you to focus on what you need to focus on, because you're able to find the source of pain. You have a better chance to actually cure the addiction that you may be experiencing. And when it comes to still the example that I gave with work, uh, pretty much workaholics and drug addicts are after the same thing, which is dopamine.
Yes.
Right? And some people can get even addicted to their own stress hormone, like adrenaline.
Yes.
So once we understand and we know that we have some stuff to work on, right? And let's say that we start engaging into these kind of practices. What does a trauma release feel like for someone? How can someone know that they are actually doing the right thing and they are making progress?
Very good question. Thank you for that one. There's many levels of realizing and experiencing that you are actually releasing the pain that has caused the suffering. I would say, and this comes back to the example I mentioned at the very beginning of this podcast, is I could see the being in the same situation with, let's say, with my father and the fathers and the boys in the park not being triggering, which means it was not creating suffering for me, because the pain aspect of that suffering was being addressed over the years. Same in any other example. Whereas if we start slowly, I think it comes from both sides, start slowly removing the, let's say, artificial dopamine sources and replacing them with natural dopamine sources. An example being scrolling and addiction to social media with actual, genuine person to person connection. That's natural, creates a really good type of dopamine, and not really one that we are built for as humans, unnatural when it comes to being overwhelmed on social media. Same with substance abuse. Overeating all types of foods, not really nourishing our body, creates dopamine. It's also an addictive response to trauma and suffering. And slowly transitioning and finding joy in eating foods that are nourishing, actually nourishing to our body, giving our body more energy, more sources to thrive from. And also, what I would say is, on top of that, releasing some of the pain and addressing it. In At the beginning, I wouldn't go to try everything, but just addressing it in a way that, first of all, taking stock, secondly, connecting with a professional or professionals or experts in the field of releasing trauma. And that could be psychosomatic therapy, that could be a CBT therapy, which is cognitive behavior therapy, which is the most well known type, which is just talk therapy. Engaging in maybe specific types of breath work. So at the beginning, I would suggest to try and be open to a few different modalities and see which one works best for you. And what works for me might not work for you, and vice versa. That's why I would encourage someone to be open minded about all these types of therapies. We have a fantastic time on earth right now where it comes to access to all these resources. We have ability to access most of this online. If you're a person that really needs that tactile and in-person experience, you also most likely have access to some sort of modality and therapy and therapist quite near you. So the excuse of not being able and not having access, and also not having financial resources to do so, is almost eradicated because we have access to it. So I would first encourage someone to try, and secondly, really connect with these practices, give them a try, and select maybe 2 or 3 that really connect with you, where not only it's not overwhelming for you as a person, but you feel an immediate relief and release. And you asked me how it could feel. I always say to my clients that it will actually get worse before it gets better. Why? Because you have not worked with this pain before. You're used to the suffering as a result of this pain, which suffering, you got used to it. The first times when you start working with the pain of that wound, of that trauma, it can be overwhelming, slightly. It's a big part of the professional you work with is, especially at the beginning of your relationship, is to get you ready for that pain, for maybe that overwhelm temporary for a few hours or an hour. So you build that resilience and not get discouraged. Oh, this was too much. I cannot do this again. Big part of what I do is create that safety for my clients so they know what's coming. So they know it might feel temporarily uncomfortable, but it will pass, because everything will pass in terms of working with trauma. And then revisit it to the point where you can stay long enough with the pain, and it is scientifically proven you only need to stay for 60 seconds with the actual painful experience to feel the pain in your body in order to release that pain body and completely release that pain from your whole subconscious. 60 seconds. And I want to give you this beautiful example of one of the early sessions of psychosomatic release I gave into one of my friends. He reached out with an immense amount of anger and pain and sorrow that he was experiencing. But what I wanted to specifically share with you was about where it was stored in his body, because I just mentioned that it can be stored for many, many years. And he himself have told me that he had to quit his hockey career because he always had lower back pain, especially around his pelvic bone. And none of the physiotherapists that he had amazing access to could help him. And now, as a 30 something year old man, many years after he quit, obviously he has a different career, but he's always been carrying that lower back pain, no matter what type of sport he was doing. And when we went into the session, at the time he was already quite emotionally resilient. He's tried different modalities, so emotionally he was able to access a lot. And by guiding him through my method, we came to the core of the wound that he was carrying and the emotions that were attached to it. And it transpired, so it always becomes either a physical object as an emotional pain body that's connected to your an emotional wound that's connected to your emotional pain body. And it was a metallic rusted anchor that was precisely anchored on the lower side of his pelvic bone. And with the part of the method, we were able to release it. And days later, with the integration that's in process, he came back to me and he said, I am not feeling any lower back pain for the first time in all my life since the injury that I thought created it. And that already feels insane. And then later on, months later, when I checked in with him and actually recorded the podcast with him as well, it became apparent that, and when I asked him like, how you feel about your lower back, he's like, there's no pain anymore. It's gone. It's gone. And this was one of the confirming beliefs in the power of this method, the power of psychosomatic release, that it can remove physical symptoms from your body. And where I say about physical symptoms, these physical symptoms can feel like tension in your upper back, where we have a lot of men carry tension in our neck, where we have tension in our arms. When we are slouching, making ourselves smaller, not being able to open up and fully express. This is all symptoms of trauma being stored in our body. It comes from this moment where anytime there is this emotional wounding, we tense in our body, and that tension stores. So that how it feels is full on emotional but also physical relief on the tissues, on the fascia, on the muscles and joints of our body.
So you mentioned that if trauma is not being addressed, it's going to stay with you forever. But is there a way to completely heal from trauma?
Yes, it's a very good question. And I think a lot of people who are suffering and suffered for a long time believe, and there is a general consensus and belief that trauma stays with you and people accept the baggage that they carry with themselves. I, based on my experience, my own personal ones, and with my clients, I can with certainty tell you that you can heal all your emotional wounds. It starts with all of the practices that we have discussed in the past hour. And I believe that you can not only heal the trauma for yourself and then see the change, and you become the beacon of light for others. What will look like is your behaviors will change, your triggers will disappear, you will feel clear and light in your body and in your mind, and especially in your heart. But also, what's going to happen is you're going to see all the situations and world in a very different way. Obviously, much more positive, but also, I believe that every time we clean the wounds and then properly heal the emotional wounding, we remove one layer of lenses that we have that we see the life through. And when we move and remove all of those lenses, we start seeing the life exactly as it is, clearly as it is, which the most prevalent revelation and thought for me after healing all of my wounds was to realize that the life is happening for me, not to me. It's a very big shift in consciousness to see the life unfolding for me with all its beauty, all its gifts, rather than life being the challenge that it is or was, being this almost a negative energy that everything is happening to me. Why is this so hard? Why is this happening to me? And that shift is, in my opinion, one of smaller signs of seeing in maybe some parts of your life where you heal the wounds, but also in general, when you start having this as a main guiding thought in your life, as life is happening for me and I'm blessed and I'm grateful. This is one of the biggest indicators of seeing yourself completely healed. And I've mentioned being a hope and beacon of hope and light for others. And I think by the work that you as a person start to do, you become an example for your family, for your friends group, for the people you share your knowledge and your experience and your learning from, unveiling and going through the suffering to the cause of the pain. You become the role model. You become the person that shows that it's possible. And the more people that believe in themselves that it is possible to fully heal, the world will become a better place.
So everything starts with you.
Yes.
What do we do if we see or we know that someone needs to work on themselves, or we have noticed that someone actually needs help? Like, how can we support them?
I think I would firstly come back to what I just said, and become the example, the positive reinforcement in their life. And becoming example is not about showing up when you're done. I believe it starts with showing up with vulnerability to the people around you. And maybe those people that you already know might need help as well as you just recognize for yourself. And showing up with that vulnerability and telling them, I just realized I think I need help. I'd love to share it with you. And then going and doing the work and then showing back to them and them seeing the results in a lot of cases, I believe, is already enough. Because the reality of it is, we not necessarily as humans, we don't want to live in pain and suffering. That's not our default state. But a lot of times, we don't know what to do, where to start, how to do it. And when we have someone close in our environment, in our friends group, Or because of social media, that distance is so short now, we can relate to someone 2,000 kilometers away because they're sharing their story like we're sharing my part of a story here. Someone could watch this in Alaska and be like, I really vibrate and vibe with this person, with this guy, and it speaks to me. And maybe if there is one person that gets inspired from this conversation today, that will be fantastic. So, being that beacon is number one, I would say. And sharing, not being afraid to share your wins and your losses in your own journey. And I have to say, I've been afraid of that for some time in the past where I felt I need to come done, I need to come complete. I can only show the final result. And I don't believe it's the case. I think there is so much more power in showing your process and what you're going through. So that would be number one. Secondly, and I say this with a lot of context, and the context being obviously the person that you want to help, you know them, you know how they react to certain triggers in life. I would be very sensitive to how they can get triggered by maybe a direct confrontation or a direct conversation. So it needs to come with a lot of sensibility. And the message could be just by showing, oh, you know what? I feel this conversation or this situation that happened and triggered you could have seen or seemed different or affected you different if you could maybe relive that. Would you do something different? So maybe encouraging someone to reflect on their actions. If that's too confronting for someone, I would then suggest the easiest method is to ask them inquiring, open ended question or questions so they can realize what is happening for them, what is their truth. And I think there's nothing more powerful when a person is being asked these questions and obviously feels safe to share an inquiry for themselves. Because, I would say it even shorter. You want to facilitate space for someone by asking these questions so they experience an aha moment. The moment when they go like, oh, fuck, I get it now. I think that speaks volumes for the quality of friends that you might have in your life when they help you to realize things that you might overlook and oversee yourself. And I've been fortunate enough to have these friends around me for many years, and I would gladly include you because the quality of the conversations always bring me back to reflecting on the past and on the situations that I'm living, and I might be connected emotionally. And having someone who is not emotionally involved in the situation that I am is a fantastic resource to have.
Atlas, thank you so much. I'm pretty sure that we are going to continue this, but I think this is a wonderful way to wrap it up. So people know that there's a way, and there are people out there who are ready to help them. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Really appreciate you for taking the time today and setting this up.